Hey there, and welcome back to the B2B Marketing Asia podcast. My name is Joe Escobedo, and today's topic, I think everyone can understand, resonates with them. It's about change and the fear of change. So today's topic is change. It's not as scary as you think. So we'll be talking about it from a couple different perspectives, one of which from an individual perspective. So if you are a leader and you are still fearful of coming on podcasts, you're doing public speaking, you're putting yourself out in terms of thought leadership, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then from an organization, if you're an organization that is kind of stuck in your ways, you're used to doing things the old ways, and you really feel like you need to make a change, but you don't know how, or you're too scared to do so. So we'll be talking about those two things, maybe some other ideas, fun stuff that'll pop up. But with me is my special guest today, is Tony Peters, who is pre-sales APAC at Celtra. Thanks so much for being on the show, Tony.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
So I know you have a depth of experience talking about, overcoming change in different organizations over the years. I really, really love to get your thoughts in. Let's start at the individual, because I think without the individual understanding, change, overcoming some of the fear, you can't do it from an organizational point of view. So I'd love to hear kind of your experience, maybe either yourself or other leaders you've seen kind of overcome this fear of change.
That's right. I mean, yeah, from my experience, and I've worked with quite a few different vendors, different companies and individuals, both here in APAC and in the UK as well. I find, from an individual point of view, I find it, especially with vendors, they're working with software platforms, they may have been burnt before. So moving to a different platform, it hasn't gone as well as they thought. They've moved into another role. They've seen that platform pop up again, and it scares them. So they're like, oh, I can't go through this change again. I'll stick with what we've got, try and make a way forward. The other way I see very common is that the individuals that you approach talking about change is that they are simply too busy. In their mindset, they have so much work to do in their day-to-day or business as usual that they can't even envision trying to do something else. Where are they going to fit this change in, that transition, etc.? So they keep putting off, and it doesn't get done. And they're scared to have an impact on their own KPIs. They think their boss is going to come down on them because they've got so much work to do, etc. So I think there's a few different angles of getting burnt by previous experience, but then also they're just too busy and they can't even think about changing. It scares the bejesus out of them.
Those are really two good points that I hadn't thought about, is really understanding the own inherent biases. And we all have biases through our past experiences. And it's important, like you said, you bring up a very good example. If I'm making to make a shift from, say, one marketing automation platform to another, there could be one where I had a terrible experience. So, screw it. I'm just going to go back to using Excel sheets because that's the safer route for me. So I think understanding that is an excellent one. And then the other point is just time. I think everyone nowadays is time starved. So how do you make the change as, reduce the friction, make it as easy for them as possible? And I think you got me thinking when you were talking about setting expectations in my own business. So for example, even running these podcasts, letting people know what is the time commitment, rather than saying, hey, look, we'd love to have you on the podcast, saying, look, we do a 15-minute pre-call, and then we do, the interviews are usually 30 minutes. That's it. 45 minutes max. We'll do everything from there. That's all it takes. So I think that may help, reduce some of the friction in terms of people saying, look, that sounds great, but I'm super slammed at the moment. I don't have time to do it. I think you bring up really, really good points about kind of understanding the barriers or blockades that people have inherently in their life. And I think that applies to everyone here.
Yeah. And I really do think that the time aspect, where people feel they don't have enough time to change, that's going to really come back and bite them, because change is going to be inevitable, especially when you're looking at things like digital marketing, e-commerce, etc. We've seen huge amounts of change even in the last year. And sometimes we've seen companies that have been forced to go through e-commerce. They haven't wanted to because they've been putting it off, more traditional, especially if you're here in the region. And they suddenly have to jump into this e-commerce, and they've had to do it, and they haven't done it very well, because they've had to leap into it rather than take it bit by bit, bite by bite, and actually lead into it at their own pace. They've put it off, and then suddenly, bang, it's had to hit them. Or the boss has said, you've got to do this now, and it's too much to swallow as a big bang. So yeah, change is coming. It's just much better to do it at your own pace and actually do it properly and over time, then suddenly it forces you to have to do it, because that's never going to be nice, and it's not going to be successful doing it that way.
Absolutely. And got me thinking of two different angles, one of which is the company side. And I think to your point, there was a joke about what caused digital transformation in most organizations, and people said COVID. But I think it's very much true. And I think if you look at the shift, a lot of people were very much reliant on these offline events, and they tried to make the shift towards webinars. But to your point, like you said, they didn't have any time to really put them out. So they were just basically copying and pasting something that would have happened offline. And there was a lot of terrible webinars and virtual experiences because of that. So you make a really good point in terms of, if you have more time to plan it out, obviously you can put out a better deliverable, or have a better outcome. And then I was thinking about it from the individual's point of view. So this got me thinking that a lot of people are very hesitant about building their personal brand. They only start doing it when they've been laid off. And to your point, when you get to the point where you already laid off, you've wasted too much time. You're basically you've dug your hole, and it's so difficult to climb your way out. Versus planting those seeds before you even get laid off, or before you need to look for a new career. Planting those, making sure that you are having some kind of change going on, even if it's minor change, can make a huge difference. Rather than say, bam, you get laid off, now what? Which happens to a lot of us. It happened to me, and at that time I was really screwed because I didn't have a brand. No one heard about me, and to get on employers' radars, particularly now during a crisis, it's really, really hard. So I think you bring up some excellent points there.
Yeah, and it's and the other point is that that change where it's almost like forced upon you from a software or platform point of view, that can be really scary. I mean, how many times have individuals been burnt by things, and also businesses, because the implementation hasn't gone right, it hasn't been the right fit, that kind of software or platform or way of working hasn't gone right. That sets that bias up, both from the individual and also the business point of view. And that's something that's going to have to be managed, both from the vendor side, a partner side, and also the business side of things, because change has to happen. You have to move forward. You can't still be using the old tools like Excel to do things. It may work for now, but it's not going to work in the future. We need to be able to adapt and adjust these biases that you mentioned.
Absolutely. And I would love to get your thoughts on this. Is something I've kind of struggled with over the years, is how do you strike the balance between, as a salesperson, selling the dream versus setting clear and realistic expectations? Because at the end of the day, most salespeople, they will want to sell the dream no matter what, even if the deal doesn't go through, because they're not really responsible for the post sale process. But if you're an entrepreneur like myself who looks at it end to end, how do you strike the balance between setting this vision of what you could achieve versus making it realistic, and then what you could potentially achieve, so they're not kind of disappointed once they actually do sign the deal?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and quite often the salesperson gets a bad rap because of this. They looks like, some people think they're selling snake oil. They're just trying to make the money and run, and that's where a position like me comes in, which is the pre-sales. I help support that salesperson, and it's almost like a tag team. The salesperson does the discussions, the commercials, and things like that. I come along and try and keep things real, so to speak, even though we're speaking the same page. But I think when it comes down to software and vendors, there's almost two different sides. One is the SaaS, which is where I'm at the moment, which is Celtra, which is actually much safer bet to talk about going forward, because it's almost like what you see is what you get. But the real change here is process, is actually using the platform. So you've got to make open people's eyes and talk about and be real with them about the change that they're going to go ahead with within the organization, and the change of working. Now, people don't like changing anyway. It's a human thing. We don't like change inherently. So it's about talking to them, talk about realistic, and showing, like, if you do it this way, start off small, going up, that change becomes incrementally, and you're talking about the value they're going to get along each of those changes. At the end of the day, you want to talk about making their life easier, making them happy, and making them look like heroes and champions to their boss. But the other side is the platform vendors. Now we're talking like the Salesforces, the Adobes, and things like what Adobe Digital Marketing Cloud, for instance. Great software, but they're platforms. And this is really important because when a salesperson goes in, I do a demo or something like that, we're showing them that vision. We're really talking about the art of the possible and things like that. Now, when they actually buy and then they get the platform, it's normally implemented by a partner. And what comes out the other end isn't always what they've seen at that demo side of things. I've got kind of this analogy where you go in and you say, okay, you go into a showroom, you maybe go in and have a car, it could be a Tesla or something like that. You're great, it's automatic, I've got my steering wheel, I can accelerate and all things like that. And it goes, okay, I'm going to put an order down and then it's going to be ready in 6 months because it's a really hot model. And then 6 months come, that car gets delivered to you and you go, something's not quite right here. The steering wheel is on the other side. When it's not automatic anymore, it's now manual, but my clutch is actually a handle I pull on the roof, and my gear change is actually something I pull a lever behind my seat. Now I can drive it, but it's not very intuitive. So this is the kind of disconnect we see from those kind of initial sales demos to actually a delivery of a product. Yes, it's usable and it ticks all the boxes in the RFP and the requirements, but there's a breakdown somewhere along that way. And that's where I see that communication is really key here. Communication between the vendor, the implementation partner, and the end user customer of this. I'm not talking about the customer who goes and buys a product off the platform, but the actual end user, business user of doing this. I really believe that communication is key, not just when that sales process stops, but continuing on that same conversation all the way through to delivery and beyond on there. Kind of like what you do, Joe, on that entrepreneur side, is that end to end, that same conversation needs to keep going all the way through to make sure they get what's expected. That level of expectation just kind of goes out the window quite often when you're talking about platform software.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's easier for me to talk about this because as an entrepreneur, I'm looking at it from end to end. If you're in a larger organization, you're probably looking at it from one perspective. You may be looking at it from pre-sales or post-sales or customer support and things like that. So your KPIs, what you're responsible for, will change depending on your functions if you're in a larger organization. I think some brands have done it very well. So I interviewed Confluence VP, and he was talking about how he looks at it from end to end. And as a leader, he understands the importance of kind of, they call it the post onboarding process, because that's what drives renewals and retention, which if you're in the software and the tech space, that's going to drive ultimately the bulk of your revenue over the longer period of time. But I think to your point, very few people understand the processes that need to go in place. Yeah. So he was sharing in our interview how he breaks it up in different milestones. So most times, you'll have a CSM who will, or a salesperson who will only look at it at the very beginning and the very end of the deal. And then there's nothing in between. So he says he has different milestones set up. So it could be the first 30 days, the first 90 days, the first 6 months. So what are some of the things you need to do in order to go back to processes? What are some of the things you could expect in terms of potential results? And, what are some of the pitfalls? So what are some of the things you might look out for in terms of, getting people on board, getting project teams to buy into what you're doing and actually get it implemented. So they actually have clearly outlined it. I think it's in part of the reason they've been able to grow so fast, but I think it's a good lesson for the rest of us to understand that post-sales process and really understand how you can, alleviate some of the pain thereafter.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that does take a little bit more resources to do that. It does take a little bit more time. It takes a little bit away from the seller or the pre-sales as well to be able to do this. But at the end of the day, more and more businesses are going to an ARR model, recurring revenue, and the success of the customers is absolutely important. You don't want churn. I know there's a lot of vendors out there that actually penalize the salespeople, that if someone does drop out after a year or 2 years, then that commission gets clawed back. So there's part of a way, there's a vested interest in doing that. But I still believe that it's down to the communication that goes through there. Really important for the implementation partner. I say this because how often do you see a vendor go in and they do the sale just by themselves, or the partner goes and does the sale and they're not in it together and they don't interact with the business users? It may be just procurement they're speaking to, and it's like a boiling pot of requirements that's gone in, is mixed up like a witch's brew. It comes out and you go, this is what we want to build. And then the business user, the next time they see it is actually upon delivery. And then the maybe the vendor or has done all the sales process, the partner's not been involved at all. They then go and speak to the customer and say, what do we want? Okay, we want X, Y, Z. And this is a big problem I've seen, is that the vendor or the customer makes assumptions based on what the vendor has shown them in the demo. They think, oh, this is great. And because it was shown, they assume it's going to be there. Now, because it needs to be built up on top of this platform that's been sold, it hasn't been mentioned to the partner, so of course it doesn't get built. Why should the partner build something they've not been paid for? So if it's not in the requirements, they're not going to build it, because they're not going to spend money on building something that's not there. So then we start to see a disconnect, and something a bit different has been delivered, the different way of working. And I really think that this sort of disconnect and the wrong delivery, or it could be wrong, just different delivery that's provided for this, has really burnt a lot of bridges in people's minds about getting a new platform or going for this sort of big bang, something new, digital marketing suite or something like that, because they've been burnt before. And it's just left a really bad taste in their mouth, and they're just very resistant to it. So I think it can be managed, but it's just going to take this communication and educating about how this process can be better. But everyone needs a vested interest in this to make it happen going forward.
Yeah, you bring a very good point in terms of bringing everyone to the table as early as possible. I've seen this in my previous roles where, the client maybe purchased something, and as a service provider or as a partner, we weren't aware, and so we had to build it out. But I think it goes back to your point, is that's where hidden costs come into play, where, you're sold something as a client, but you realize you have to build something out, and that is additional cost in terms of what you've already spent in the platform. So obviously the customer is quite upset, and then the partner is like, well, I actually need the additional resources, budget to build it out. Otherwise, we can't actually do what you're looking to do. So really, really good points for bringing everyone to the table. I'm curious in terms of, once again, how can you reduce the friction? Let's say you're selling an enterprise platform, which most of our clients are doing, say 100K and up. Do things like maybe free trials or like pilots, like, does that have an impact in terms of reducing some of the friction on enterprise level software?
It can do, but it really depends on that platform. And I actually in agreement with quite a lot of vendors here about giving free trials and things, is because that can give a wrong impression of a platform, especially if we're talking about a platform that needs to be built up and configured in a very particular way to a customer's way of doing business. So talk about a CMS, for example, like an enterprise level, AM, Acquia, something like that. They need to be built up in a way that is suitable for the business that's being sold to and their end customers. Now, if you give a free trial, it's going to be a demo. It's going to be something that's set up in a particular way, and it's not going to tick all the boxes because it hasn't been configured, set up, and built upon. And also the way of working, it should be configured for that end business user. Now, that demo or the one that they've been given for this free trial may not be suitable. They may need to work in a different way, and that can lead to the wrong impressions. Now, I like the idea of almost like a build along or a hand holding thing. It's a little bit different, especially this year when we're talking about can't be able to travel. But I like the idea of being able to go and sit down with a few people or some of these business users and actually walk through some stuff with them in person. Let them click and do things like that. So it's almost like a build along kind of thing. So they can kind of understand, but you're also helping teach them. Because these are enterprise level softwares, if we're talking about those, they do come with a learning curve. Could you imagine sitting someone down with something like Adobe Analytics, for example, and saying, here you go and use it. And they've just been using Google Analytics before. There's so many great features and functions there that they wouldn't have a clue about how to use. And they think, why am I paying X amount incrementally more to do this when they're only just touching the surface features like Google Analytics is providing? They won't be able to see that incremental value. So trials and things are very tough. I really think that what can help there is testimonials. They're really, really useful in enterprise, but also having really good relationships with the implementation partner. And vendors need to get this very real partnership there and just being honest about things, talking about these so-called hidden costs, etc.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think LinkedIn, when I was working with LinkedIn, does an incredible job of this, of really building out their agency partnerships. Because to your point, those are the ones who are actually implementing, for example, LinkedIn campaigns. It's not necessarily the brands themselves, it's their partners or their agencies. So they've done an excellent job in terms of helping not only educating them but enabling them. So going back to your point, building along. I love the concept of building along with what you're doing, because it helps facilitate the relationship, because there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can rely on technology and you can say, look, here's the onboarding thing. And I think of it as a simpler platform. So for example, we're using Thinkific for our online courses, and they've done a very good job, because it's like, step one, do this, step two. So it's like 10 steps to launch your course. And because that is a smaller ticket item where, maybe it costs $100 a month, they won't have the resources to go and build along with you. But let's say, to your point, you're selling something for 100K and up, then yeah, it would be nice to have someone who is there with you. Yes, you can go through all the educational materials, but there are always those little things like, okay, how do you do this, or how would we do this for our company? So it's not even so much like the step-by-step process, which I think checklists and online videos can be super helpful. It's even questions like, okay, how would this make sense for our specific audience? Which obviously, if you have a generic template or checklist or onboarding videos, it's not going to do. So you need that additional person, kind of like you said, building it along with you or hand holding you, to help facilitate that process. Otherwise, I've been on the other side. You get really, really frustrated. You're like, why the heck do we buy this? And then, you scrap the whole deal altogether. So really, really good practical points here.
Yeah, and it's not easy for all parties involved. The sellers obviously trying to sell, they've got to make their things up, and sometimes it can be very frustrating. From a sales point of view, it's like, why can't you just see this value? Is because from a vendor point of view, we know all these bits and pieces. We understand it, but a customer doesn't understand these little bits and pieces. And it's also priorities. What we think is, actually, that's not very useful, that bit of functionality or that value and stuff, but it could be very high on someone else you're talking to. So having that empathy there is really, really important. And then also having that, again, bringing that partner in, that implementation partner, getting them to understand not just the customer's requirements, but the discussions you've had from a vendor point of view. Because if you've shown a whizzy feature that needs to be built upon, the customer then assumes that it's going to be part of there and it's going to be built that way, but they don't put it in, then the implementation doesn't build for that or in that particular way. It's going to be, the vendor's going to get in trouble, because you think, oh, but you showed us this. Why is it not there? And if that communication is not there, then you're just going to have a breakdown, aren't you? It's so being very honest and clear and talking about these things and getting empathy with all the parties is important. And that's also empathy with the implementation partner as well, because they've got to make their money. They've got to put their resources there and things like that. And sometimes they need to do a little bit of chopping of the scope, etc. But you've got to make sure that it's in the right places and the priorities are still in the right places that the customer wants as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are excellent points on the pre-sale side. I want to swing back to the personal side as well, because I think you bring some really good points. You talked about obviously time constraints and personal biases. Is there any other things that you've come across where people are like, look, I'm not willing to change anything else that has been commonplace about the leaders you've worked with or any peers?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and you get this with more traditional companies as well, don't you? Where it's like, change, we've been doing it this way, or you've got like more of elderly leadership, etc., that have been doing things very traditionally. It took them a long time maybe to move from paper to Excel, for instance. So yeah, change is always going to be difficult. Sometimes you'll get new blood into the company. It could be a new CMO or something like that wants to stamp their mark. But sometimes they get very frustrated and leave quite quickly because they can't make that change. I really do believe that testimonials really help here. Things like round tables, joining these, getting other people who have made these changes. It's always going to be a bit of pain, but exposing those pains as well so people can learn from them. Is important. So yeah, communication amongst peers, I believe, could help, really help there. But sometimes as an individual, they can't be moved around there. So it could be bypassing them or something like that without treading on too many toes. But I think from a sales point of view, from a vendor, is not, I think really important is not just relying on one person as your champion. Within there, that's all too easy to do. If you go in and they're happy to make changes and they're your champion, and of course as a salesperson, this person's on board with me, and you just want to communicate with those. Sometimes you need to speak to the people who are resistant to that change, get them involved as well, and then start to spread the people you're speaking to, because they're the ones you want to have the conversations with and speak about your end and propose your value, rather than letting the champion just do it, because you don't know what relationship they have. So don't just rely on your champion. Speak to the people who are resistant to that change and put your point of view across, put your value proposition across to them. No better person to explain it than yourself, rather than getting your champion to go and do it and doing the sort of like middle management talking, going around in between, and maybe getting your value proposition a bit wrong. So
yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing I try to learn early in my sales career, was understanding, the buying committee, particularly in B2B. And to your point, yes, it's important to understand that. Sometimes, though, the client may not disclose the entire buying committee. They say, oh, it might be from someone from finance, or it might be someone from procurement, or it might be something from, but you don't actually know. And I think that's where it gets a bit tricky. But I think at least asking the question is helpful, because then you can start identifying the biases that they're going to have from their own perspective. Because each division, obviously in an organizational, and then in a departmental, and then an individual, they'll have biases across those. So the more I guess you can unearth and discover as early in the process, the more you can help overcome those.
And don't be afraid of the challenge. Go in and speak to these hard people. They're the ones that you're going to have to convince, and it's better if you speak to them, I think.
Absolutely. And you bring up a really, really good point, is who is going to be more credible? And I always ask my clients this question: is it going to be, the person selling the product or service, or is it going to be a peer of theirs? And I think it brings a really, really good point in terms of, a roundtable discussions, or even, educational things where you are inviting a client to speak about their experience, because I think those are far more impactful than, you or me or whoever is selling the service or technology, to say, hey, look, this is the greatest, because yes, we have a vested interest. But if you are a client, you don't really have an invested interest. You don't really care either way if the deal closes. So you're just simply sharing your experience. And I think that's something that more of us should do. And once again, I'd love to hear in terms of like testimonials, because traditionally you think of testimonials, you get the headshot, and then you think of the nice quote that are splattered across sales decks and web pages. I've started interviewing some of my clients, so I have snippets of them saying nice things about the work we do. Are there any other things, because I think you've mentioned testimonials a couple of times, is there any creative ways of really showcasing customer testimonials, or impactful ways?
Showcase, it's always nice to start off with that slide to begin with. Have the slide with the headshot and the quote. That's always a nice one to start off with, because it's easy, as long as you obviously get permission to do that. That could just be put on your standard decks and things. The videos is always nice. Now, do people watch those videos on their own time? That's whether you're in control of that or not. Maybe it could be part of your sales thing, but it's always nice to have someone available who can be spoken to, that can actually be able to pick up the phone and actually speak to them and talk about this. But you have to be really wary of these, about not overusing them. So really keep them in your pocket. If there's like a super deal that's coming in, it's hinging on this, and you've got to pull out the guns, then start to use them. Really don't overuse those. We've seen vendors as well that at certain events, or you go to events and things, they keep on wheeling out the same person. That gets a little bit boring sometimes, especially if they do go to a lot of these events. That can be a bit of a turn off. So try and mix it up as well. But I think this really starts to come around full circle now, Joe, because we talk about that change. Getting a big software platform now, whether it's creative automation I'm in now, through to digital marketing or graphic software, stuff like that, it is a change. So if we can help them be successful now, whether it's through that sales process onto the implementation and then the actual using it, then they're going to be successful, and they're going to want to speak on your behalf and actually get some good PR from it. So I think that if we can actually work on this change and make it a bit more palatable for people, they're going to be willing to speak up, which then helps us bring on more customers, more change, and it's going to be a nice self-fulfilling thing. So, and obviously recurring revenue is always nice. So I think, if we can all do our part to try and ease this change and not make it as difficult, it's going to really help us with these, allowing more people to speak to mix it up, so we don't wheel out the same people all the time and they get bored. It's going to be really helpful.
Absolutely. You bring us a really, really good points. I really appreciate you sharing those with us, Tony. I jotted down some good notes as well. We haven't had a chance to plug your current organization, so if you wanted to plug it now, you're more than welcome to before we and
Sure,
today's
yeah.
topic.
Thanks. I've been working many years on the CMS side of things. If you do know me, I've done lots of digital marketing over the years. I took a slight step away and I'm into creative automation now. Again, this is about change. It's about helping things. So the company I work for is Celtra, and what we provide is this creative automation technology. We know that there's a huge amount of channels out there for things like adverts, banners, etc. Even personalization on emails, segmentation when you're speaking to different customers. What we provide is taking those great designs and animations for things like After Effects, Photoshop, etc., bringing them into their platform and then scaling them across all different sizes, all different formats like Facebook, etc., but then also separating the design and content. So you can then speed up all of this content across these designs through automation, different languages, different promos, different segments, etc., and then pumping out all these different channels. Customers like Spotify, Adidas, locally Lazada, etc., having great successes with us. Again, it's about helping customers, and yeah, customers have to go through this change, but at the end of the day, this creative automation is really, really helping them scale, and it's keeping their marketing teams happy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tony. Really appreciate you coming to the show. Like I said, a lot of good insights. Last question is, how can people get in touch with you to find out more about what you do and what you're up to?
Absolutely. You can go onto our website, which is Celtra.com. You can email me, tony@celtra.com. Nice and easy there. Or you can just look me up on LinkedIn under Tony Peters. So yeah, good to hear from you. If you've got any discussions, let's keep it up. And yeah, we'll chat again soon, Joe, and look forward to hearing from any of you.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much again, Tony. Really appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Really means the world to us. Keep it coming. Please stay safe, everyone. Take care with everything that's going on in the world. And we'll see you very, very soon. Later.